welcome. I'm really excited that you all are here. During this Lenten season, we have been doing some things that I hope have given some life to our Lenten practices. A couple weeks ago, we had a class on forgiveness. Next week, we will be doing our big Canvas labyrinth in here, along with some prayer stations. And the following week, we will have a virtual Stations of the Cross. But today, I am very excited to welcome Dr. Amelia Kennedy of Princeton Seminary. She is the assistant professor of the history of medieval Christianity. She is a religious and cultural historian of medieval Europe whose research focuses on histories of health, medicine, aging, and disability, as well as Christian monasticism. So I have invited her here today, really excited to have her perspective on some of the history of Lent. Many of you know that I love history, so I am very excited for this. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kennedy.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here in this fabulous building. Oh my gosh, it's absolutely beautiful. And I didn't realize there would be breakfast, so thank you for the hospitality. It's been amazing. So today, as y'all may know, is Laetare Sunday, the fourth Sunday of Lent. It gets its name from Isaiah 66:10. Rejoice, O Jerusalem, or Laetare, rejoice in Latin. So it's a day of sort of celebration and relaxation in the middle of the Lenten season. So I've had 2 brownies and counting so far today to make sure to celebrate properly. It's a bit of a breather before you dive back in to the Lenten fasting and penitence. This day is also known as Mothering Sunday, and that's a term that historically has taken on a number of different valences. So this sort of idea that one might go to one's mother church where one was baptized on this Sunday. Was anyone baptized here? Okay, so so y'all are mothering on this Sunday at your mother church. There's also, an idea that one might, say something nice to one's actual mother, or one might spare a thought for the Virgin Mary, right? Thinking of mothers in all senses, literally and metaphorically. So that is today. Now, in terms of the history of Lent, what always comes to mind for me is this enormous, complicated, Where's Waldo-esque painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder. So this is a 16th century Catholic Flemish painter. And this painting is known as The Fight Between Carnival and Lent. There should be 3 handouts per table of the whole painting. And then on the back, there's some little details that are blown up so that you can sort of look at your leisure as I'm talking and try to get a sense of some of the details. So this is really a panoramic. We sort of have this almost omniscient view of a town square somewhere in the Netherlands. This work is from 1559, but art historians think that this is actually quite a nostalgic painting. He's thinking back to what are the village observances that people might have done in my grandparents' day, kind of thing. So it looks old-fashioned to us, and it also probably looked a bit old-fashioned by 1559. So we have in the foreground, right, if we zoom in here, this is sort of the centerpiece, insofar as there is one, a clash between the 2 main fighters. So on the left, there's Carnival. This is the male butcher. He is seated on a beer barrel. His weapon is rotisserie with meats. He's surrounded by wafers, cakes, all the sorts of sweets, playing cards. People are wearing costumes. There's musical instruments. Like, this guy is bringing the party. And then his opposition is Lent. So this is a thin woman who is armed with a spatula with a herring on it, surrounded by foods that are more common to Lent. So things like pretzels, fish, breads, mussels, and onions. Now, if we zoom back out to the painting as a whole, we can see that the left half of the painting is really dominated by Carnival, this, beer keg frat bro type of guy, who his main building, so that big building in the back, is an inn. We can see yet more beer kegs out in the front. So the left side of the painting, by and large, is Carnival. The right half, however, is dominated by Lent. And the main building, of course, on the right is a church. So there's over 200 figures or so in this painting. There's a lot going on. We'll circle back at the end of the talk. And again, if you want something to look at apart from the slides, you're welcome to just sort of pick out the details as I'm talking for the next few minutes. But the main question I'll take us through is, how did we get here? How did there come to be an identifiable season of fasting known as Lent, identified with particular foods, particular customs, in opposition to what comes before, beginning with Ash Wednesday and ending with Holy Saturday? Where does Lent come from? There's no Lent in the Bible, per se. But there are multiple episodes with 40-day fasts. That number 40 is quite popular. So in the Hebrew Bible, or in the Christian Old Testament, we see in Exodus, Moses is fasting for 40 days and 40 nights before receiving the 10 Commandments. He neither ate bread nor drank water. So this is a very hardcore fast. In 1 Kings, Elijah fasts for 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Horeb. So again, he is doing the 40-day fasting period. And then again in the New Testament, we see in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus goes into the desert. He fasts. During this time, he's tempted by the devil for 40 days and 40 nights. And so this idea is sort of taken from these various episodes in the Bible. And in the decades following the time of Jesus and the apostles, it sort of becomes what we know as Lent. We don't know exactly when or why this biblical idea of a 40-day fast came to be associated specifically with Easter, although we have some sort of suppositions. Right, so the term Tessarakosti, or the 40 in Greek, is used in Canon 5 of the Council of Nicaea. This is a big church council in 325. And so they're saying, this one synod that should be held to talk about what to do with excommunicated people should be held, one of them before Lent, before this 40 days. So the idea seems to have already been there by 325, that there is a season of Lent, 40 days of fasting, prior to Easter. Some scholars have associated the origins of Lent with the pre-baptismal periods of fasting that are attested in some very early texts, such as the Didache. And so Easter appears to have been a favored day for baptism, at least in certain regions. If you're going to get baptized anyway, you might as well get baptized on the best day possible. And so that's Easter. So, for example, the North African writer Tertullian indicates that this is the case for his community. It's popular to get baptized on Easter, and then one wants to prepare a bit leading up to that. But again, there's not a lot of evidence. We don't know this is like a universal custom. And so more research is required. Now, Lent is supposed to be 40 days of fasting. How exactly did people calculate it? First of all, it depends on the date of Easter, which is determined by the lunar calendar, the first Sunday after the full moon after the spring equinox. So Lent is then 40 days before that. Luckily, people online have just figured all of that out now, and so we do not have to do the math. But this was also a major area of dispute in the Middle Ages. People have different ideas about how and when to calculate Easter, and all sorts of astronomical skills that I lack. In the East, so in the areas around like Constantinople, it became common for the Lenten fast to be 5 days a week, so Monday through Friday, for 8 weeks. So that's 56 days total. 40 of them are fasting days. And then in Rome and in the West, the Latin-speaking West, now sort of associated with Western Europe, but also the western bits of North Africa, it became common to fast 6 days a week, so Monday to Saturday, for 6 weeks. So that's 42 days total, of which 36 are fasting days. Now, as we come into the early Middle Ages, around the year 500 and so on, an extra 4 days of fasting are tacked on, so that Lent in the West, in Rome and its surrounding area, always begins on a Wednesday, 4 days before the first Sunday of Lent, and then we have 46 days, of which 40 are fasting days. Some people say Pope Gregory the Great is responsible for this. We don't actually really know. So, people argue, if you want to celebrate, a 56-day total Lent with 40 days of fasting, I will not stop you. There are multiple ways to do Lent. So, that's the early church, right? So a lot of uncertainty. We see certain foundations, certain practices becoming normalized. But there's also a lot we don't know. As we move forward in time, we tend to get more sources and a bit more detail about what people are doing and why. So as we come into the Middle Ages, as I've mentioned before, the earliest references to Lent are in Greek, and the term used is Tessarakosti, which then comes into Latin as Quadragesima. and this just basically means like 40, referring to the 40-day length of the fast. And so we still see this in a lot of Romance languages. The term for Lent is derived from this. So in Spanish, French, Italian, the words for Lent are very much related to that Latin quadragesima, a 40-day period. And you might notice the modern English word Lent sounds nothing like quadragesima. That's because it comes from an Old English word, Lengton, which is a word for the spring season. So etymologically probably related to the word for length, referring to the fact that the days are beginning to get longer, as we all have been appreciating lately. So Lengton becomes Lent. It's a word for spring. So there's this idea that Lent it's a period of 40 days of fasting, but it's also a period of springtime. The plants are coming up. It's a season of renewal and growth. Now, in Northern Europe in particular, having a fast in the springtime makes a lot of sense from a practical perspective. Why is this? Well, you might just think about how hard it is to get and keep and store your food over the winter. So as winter's coming to an end, as we're like coming into March, if we were living 1,000 years ago, we might find that our storehouses are running low. So we have to fast anyway, and we might as well get some sort of spiritual meaning out of that. I mean, that's not the entirety of it, but it does make sense. The timing works out, as scholars have pointed to. So how do we prepare for Lent, apart from fasting, as I'll talk about a bit more? In England and elsewhere in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, Lent proper is really preceded by an increase in liturgical solemnity. So beginning on the Sunday of Septuagesima, so that's 70 days before Easter, a full month before Lent, Alleluia is no longer sung at Mass. And this is called locking the Alleluia. By the later Middle Ages, you'll sometimes even see ceremonies where Alleluia is given a mock funeral. And also certain ceremonies like marriages typically were not carried out during this period, so even 70 days before Easter. The 3 days before Lent came to be known as Shrove Tide, during which time believers were to be shriven, which means to be given shrift or absolution by a priest after confession. So before Lent starts, one wants to go to one's priest and get shriven. And this, we don't use the word too much today apart from the phrase like to be given short shrift, which means when you have a rushed confession right before an execution. So in English, the day before Ash Wednesday is traditionally known as Shrove Tuesday. Again, so that idea of being shriven, of having absolution, saying your confession. These days, more commonly, though, referred to as Fat Tuesday or just Mardi Gras, the party that we all know and love. So unofficially, the days before Lent also come to be associated with getting one last good bout of feasting in before the fasting began. The word carnival from this period comes from the Latin carne levare, carne meaning meat. So beyond just pure hedonism, again, I mean, there is sort of a practical meaning to all of this. Like, if you have any good food left, and maybe you don't, in which case that's too bad. But if you have any good food left, like meat, cheese, right? Like, and then you're supposed to be fasting, well, you better eat it, because otherwise it'll just go off and be wasted. So get it all in before it goes off and becomes unusable. In England, the Sunday before Ash Wednesday was known as Egg Sunday, and so pancakes are a common Shrove Tuesday food because they're just a good way of using up eggs and butter, all these richer foods that one might fast from. So that brings us, so this is preparing for Lent. We're not even in Lent back at that point. We're just, the 70 days before Easter. So we've prepared, we have been shriven, we've gone to our confession, we have partied hard, we have eaten all the meat. Now it's Ash Wednesday. So on the first day of Lent, it became customary for priests to place blessed ashes on parishioners' heads. And we have attestations of this from, quite early. So all the way back, for example, in the 10th century, there's an English abbot, Aelfric of Eynsham, who describes the practice as follows. On that Wednesday, throughout the world, as it is appointed, priests bless clean ashes in church and then lay them on people's heads, so that they may remember they came from earth and will return again to dust. Just as Almighty God said to Adam after he had sinned against God's command, "In labor you shall live, and in sweat you shall eat your bread upon the earth until you return again to the same earth from which you came. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." This is not said about the souls of mankind, but about their bodies, which molder to dust, and shall again on judgment day, through the power of our Lord, rise from the earth. All who ever lived, just as all trees quicken again in the season of spring, which were deadened by the winter's chill. So again, just a clear explanation of this practice of putting the ashes on each person's head on Ash Wednesday. And again, this sort of sense of Lent as it's a time that one should be reminded that, you know, the trees are coming up again. My garden finally is looking less sad. The trees are quickening that were deadened by the winter's chill. And of course, this is a very common medieval and I think still modern sort of metaphor way of thinking about the resurrection. So the earliest mentions of placing ashes on the head that I was able to find come from the 9th century liturgical text, so a little bit earlier than this, but not by much. It was initially reserved for those who were doing public penance at the beginning of Lent. And so Aelfric is one of our earliest sources for this practice being extended not just to those doing public penance for some reason, but to the entire congregation. Now, by the late 11th century, the distribution of ashes had gained approval by the papacy. It was prescribed at the Council of Benevento by Pope Urban II in 1091. And so here we see this charming little image of, you know, priest. He's got his plate of ashes and is reaching out to bless the person. So in terms of fasting, this is probably the thing that, you know, most people, when they hear of Lent, think of first. And that's for good reason, right? Throughout the Middle Ages, the Lenten fasts and the weekly fast days, especially Fridays, are sort of essential to how people are thinking of themselves as being Christian. So in the 13th or 14th centuries, right, to be a Christian means basically, as a bare bones definition, you are someone who receives communion once a year. You're someone who fasts on Fridays and in Lent. You're someone who pays tithes. And you're someone who has your children baptized. That's the sort of minimal level of engagement with the church, with these practices that one would be expected to have at this time. So for ordinary Christians, fasting meant being abstinent from meat and other animal products. So things like milk, butter, cheese, eggs. Again, I mentioned the pancakes because if you have extra butter and eggs, you got to use those up. Milk, butter, cheese, and eggs were often referred to collectively as white meat because they come from animals and they're, I guess, kind of white. So white meat. I don't know anyone today who gives up even like white meat for Lent, but we could start a trend. Now, members of monastic orders might engage in more rigorous fasting. So, for example, the Cistercians, this is a reformist monastic order from traditionally dated to the late 11th century. They engaged in a fast of bread and water on Fridays during Lent, so much simpler even than your average Christian. Now, some categories are considered exempt, as one might expect. Theologians talk about who, you know, doesn't have to fast, and its categories commonly named would be people like children, the old, the sick, pregnant people, nursing mothers, pilgrims, beggars, manual laborers. So people for whom it would be damaging to one's health to fast. Now, fish, of course, are permitted. And this is like the real history of the McDonald's Filet-O-Fish, invented in the 1960s in a Catholic area of Cincinnati, to give the Catholics something to eat. So fish are permitted, and this includes whale, this includes dolphin, this includes beaver, if you can get it. Anything that spends most of its time in the water is a fish. So if you raise your cows like as swimming cows, like, I don't know, but we can try. Now, among the wealthy, it was very fashionable to serve imitation meat. So imitation eggs made from roe, fish eggs, imitation ham made from ground fish. So they would have loved like all the vegan burgers we have now, just all the imitation meat. They were doing it back then too. But so it's also worth saying, right? A lot of this is quite literal, right? One is, you know, in a state of sort of repentance and reflection during Lent, and this is often a quite literal in, you know, giving things up, giving up food, having a harder sort of daily life. But medieval clerics weren't completely literal minded about this, right? As people often do today, theologians are often emphasizing that it's spiritual abstinence that actually, you know, really, really matters. Abstaining from sinful thoughts and actions is more important than any physical abstinence from food. So, for example, we see, so this is famous Cistercian abbot Bernard of Clairvaux. 12th century. He wrote a number of sermons, and in this one for Lent, he wrote that Lent is a sacrament of all time and fasting a sign of all abstinence. If only the tongue sinned, then it only would fast, and that would suffice. But the other members sin, the other body parts sin, so they must fast. The eyes should fast from curiosity, the ears from tales and rumors, the tongue from detraction and murmuring, and from vain and scurrilous words, the hands from lazy signs and from all unnecessary busyness, but most of all the soul from vices and the will from its own desire. So there's already conceiving of fasting in very spiritual terms, all-encompassing. This is a holistic practice. It's not enough just to say, well, I'm going to eat my Beyond Meat burger and otherwise not think about it. So that's fasting. What else do we do during Lent in the Middle Ages? Penance is very important. Going to confession is a major part of Lent or in that period just prior. Particularly in the later Middle Ages. So the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 is often positioned as a sort of high water mark. It's a major moment in the history of church reform, and in terms of bringing more lay participation into religious and church life. And so the Fourth Lateran Council stipulated that all Christians were to confess at least once per year. This annual confession often took place during Lent, or just before. So lay people would confess to their parish priest. Priests would give their confessions to a senior cleric, known as the penitentiary. And the penitentiary, this more senior clergy member, would also deal with lay people who had perhaps sinned more seriously than could be absolved by the parish priest. There were certain sins that might be beyond a local parish priest's pay grade. Since everyone in the diocese needed to confess, and in the later Middle Ages, this would typically take place during Lent, extra priests are also employed, brought in during this time to busy places to hear confessions. Parishioners are encouraged to come and make their confessions early. In some dioceses, schedules are created to organize everyone's confessions, just to make sure this could efficiently be done. Now, during this time, there were no confessionals. Confessions took place out in the open, generally in the nave, near the chancel screen. This was done, out of a concern to avoid any appearance of impropriety on the part of the priest. But it's also kind of awkward when you are confessing. Once, when I was in fourth grade, they took us to church to say our confessions. And while I was in there confessing, and I had the screen and I had the curtain and everything was nice and private, one of my classmates comes in and just yanks open the curtain to say hello to the priest. And it was extremely appalling. But if I were a medieval person, I'd just be like, yeah, well, this isn't private anyway. So others in the church might be kept at a bit of a distance so that they hopefully can't overhear. And probably each confession lasted about 20 minutes. Any longer, it'll be difficult to get through everyone. There's 5 requirements for confession. One has to hope to be pardoned. One has to be sorry for sin, confess the sin, make the amends through penance, and avoid evil thereafter, or at least try. And during confession, the priest would, of course, inquire as to the number of occasions of sin, the time, the place, the reason, all that sort of thing. Try to ascertain the devotion of the penitent. It's also, if time allowed, medieval confession has also been known to be used as almost like a pop quiz time, right? The priest can review the basics of the faith with each parishioner. Because remember, again, people aren't having just these weekly interactions necessarily. So this is like a once-a-year check-in for many people of, do you know the creed? Do you understand and believe in important doctrines? So, for example, the real presence of Christ in the bread and wine of the Eucharist, that kind of thing. So that's penance and fasting. The final Sunday of Lent, so this is coming up, is Palm Sunday. Recalling the entry of Christ into Jerusalem on a donkey, the crowds throw down palm branches for him to ride over. And this is a really celebratory day. So processions and blessings of flowers and foliage in your average medieval church. In Western Europe, palms might not be available, so they would use like willow or yew twigs instead, branches, but they'd still call them palms. Then we come up to Holy Week, Maundy or Holy Thursday, another day of penance and confession. In medieval England, it was known as Sheer Thursday, so Sheer, a reference to the purification of confession, but also to the washing of the altars, so sort of sheer, like clearing or cleaning out. And then by the late Middle Ages, it sort of gets conflated or mixed up with Sheer, Shear, Thursday, which is the common practice of getting a haircut on this Thursday to look good for Easter. So schedule your appointments. So we have Sheer Thursday. Then we come up, of course, to Good Friday. During the Middle Ages, Mass generally is not celebrated on Good Friday. In certain places, the Passion narrative from the Gospel of John would be read. The cross would be removed from the high altar and processed through the church to be adored. And the lay people would then, there's a practice in some regions of crawling or crossing the floor on their knees. So this is a practice known as creeping to the cross. A pre-consecrated host will be dipped in wine, placed in a wooden or stone box known as the Easter sepulchre, so sort of a grave for the Eucharist. On the north side of the chancel, candles lit all around it. So marking the solemnity of the day. And then, of course, Easter Sunday coming up, but that is not, I won't get there in this talk. So that's sort of the Middle Ages. Now, I'll just talk briefly about Lent and the Reformers, the 15th and 16th centuries. Reformers are often quite skeptical of Lent, as it was understood by medieval Christians, considering it to be non-biblical, right? As I've mentioned, there is no Lent exactly in the Bible. There's sort of extrapolations from 40-day fast, but that's not quite the same thing as a biblical basis. That said, some of the reformers often thought, well, it's not such a bad thing to have a season of reflection and penitence. So Martin Luther, for example, thought, Lent is a good idea. It should be voluntary, less centered on a literal abstinence from food. So as he writes, Lent, Palm Sunday, and Holy Week shall be retained, not to force anyone to fast, but to preserve the Passion history and the Gospels appointed for that season. So he's really focused on it being a time of just remembering the Passion narrative, remembering and sort of preparing oneself spiritually for Easter, but not necessarily focus on a forced abstinence. There's also the sort of famous story of the Swiss reformer Ulrich Zwingli and his associates who committed a sort of civil disobedience by feasting on sausage during Lent. Now, Zwingli himself did not eat the sausage, but he was there. And he then gave a sermon on concerning choice and liberty respecting food. So he's using the theme of fasting during Lent to exemplify the sort of non-biblical practice that Christians should be free to ignore. And he's coming from a stance of, look, I didn't even eat the sausage, so I'm not just writing this to defend myself, but I can take a principled stance that this is just sort of a non-biblical thing that has arisen. It should not be forced, and Christians should be free to ignore it. So this all brings us back to the 1559 painting by Bruegel. At this point, of course, we have a Europe that has, Catholics and Protestants who are often living in, there's certain regions. So, for example, Catholic Spain is Catholic. The Netherlands at this time is largely under the control of a Catholic Spanish monarch. And so there's all sorts of history there that I won't go into today. But I want us to turn, and feel free to take a moment just on your own or talk to your table about this painting, because there's so much going on, about 200 figures, as I have said. And I just am curious to hear what details stick out to you the most. What kind of message does Bruegel seem to be sending about Carnival, about Lent, about the villagers of his time or of his imagined grandparents' time? Is there even any clear message? Bruegel's often seen as quite enigmatic and, not wanting to give simple answers to these questions of, Lent is clearly, bad and hypocritical, or, Carnival is obviously bad and hedonistic. So take a moment. Yeah, and there are close-ups on the back. All right, I'm curious to hear what everyone has observed in this painting. Perhaps we can have a spokesperson or two per table.
Okay, there were a couple of things we spoke about. One, firstly, we had I don't think any of us noticed the bifurcation between the Carnival and the Lent. So that was really intriguing to have someone to guide us through it. But in thinking about that and looking at the whole picture, no one in the picture looked no one looked happy or delighted at all either. So despite the Carnival, people either looked a little sick or over-imbibed, and so not particularly happy or not happy at all. And the Lenten folk, including presumably the queen of the Lent who's doing the jousting, look pretty deathly and ill and sick and don't really look reconciled to their God. So I think that was one thing I do. And then the other item is then just looking at the picture as a whole, the center of it all seems to be the couple walking away from it. And it almost seemed like it was maybe one person from each side, to me, possibly even one Carnival person and one Lenten person. Not sure why. She just seems, just because her clothing at the top looks white, or maybe it makes her look a little ghostly. I think the arm around I don't know if that's a woman, looks fairly compassionate. And it almost looked like it was the only piece of peace. And they're sort of almost walking away from it all, both the Lent as well as the Carnival.
Oh, I love a surprising commonality on both sides, right? No one's really sort of seems like happy, either in a serene or in a jubilant way, right? I think there's a guy who's like puking out the window on the one side. And then, yeah, the Queen of Lent, indeed looks, quite sickly and austere. Yeah, that's interesting. The sort of, well, it's almost like sort of he's satirizing both sides. Like you're sort of in a place of you feel like you should choose a fighter, and then you realize, wait a minute, maybe I want to be the couple walking away. That's interesting. Next table.
There's probably people who've done a PhD just on this painting. So a lot to see. Yeah. And but I think what's coming through is that although it's being painted in opposition, there's commonality. So if there's gambling in the bottom left-hand corner for the Carnival side, and Dion here is saying that on the bottom right, if you look at what looks like to be a person in a blue tunic, bending over, reaching towards somebody with a white, like hijab. Yeah, that's what Dion is saying, is that there's gambling on the right. And so I love that, because it's just light and dark. It's all the same humanity. We're all doing it. Whatever we think somebody else is doing wrong, guaranteed. Like, we're doing it too.
I have a question. Leah. What we think of as Carnival now is over drinking, over imbibing, over fascination with costumes and things like that. Did they think the same thing about Carnival? That's the thing. Yeah. Or were they more serious about the religion? Bill's shaking his head no.
Yeah, they had some pretty hard, but they definitely partied harder than I ever have in my life. Yeah, so you sort of get the sense, and certainly this is something you hear from both people on both the Catholic and Protestant side of things, trying to ban Carnival celebrations, trying to tamp down on this. The bans are repeated, which means they don't work. So there is, definitely in the later medieval period. But I think one of the things art historians have pointed to, actually, is that this celebration is a bit more homemade and village scale than the actual processions during Carnival, during Bruegel's Day. And so it's sort of, it's people casually, making the egg necklaces, people putting together their own costumes. This is very sort of village scale, homemade type of Carnival, if that makes sense. Instead of the larger, more city processions that you might see in the mid-16th century.
So one thing I notice is that the composition is very balanced. So when you first look at it, you don't really notice that there's a Carnival versus Lent side. It's not really obvious. You have to look at it much more carefully. And also the composition is highly balanced, both left and right, and also foreground, background. There's also these people, there's people kind of dotted throughout the composition doing stuff. And it's not as if you can really discern the revelers versus the repenters really easily, at least at first glance. That's what I thought was interesting.
Yeah, it is sort of like it's hard. That's sort of why I had one slide with the line down the middle, because it's actually like it's very balanced on either side in a way that these almost look like mirror images. Even with the buildings, you have the large building on the left and the right, and you have to sort of look again to say, oh, this is the inn with the beer, and this is the church. And then similarly, yeah, I feel like the two main fighters are almost sort of lost in the fray a little bit. Yeah, one has to sort of look and be like, oh, those are the two jousters, essentially. No, I think you're right. And I feel like that might be part of this painting, that sort of there's either maybe extremists on both sides. Like there's the people who are really into Carnival, there's the people who are really into Lent, and that maybe it actually shouldn't be this opposition. Like maybe these are just two seasons or 2 days or two sort of phases that we go through, whether as a person, as a community. Yeah, I mean, there's a balance there. And so maybe actually they're both good. I don't know. I'll just point out a couple other things. So one, and this is very difficult to see, but our historians have pointed out that there's also a slight temporal shift on both sides of the poem, or not the poem, the painting. So if you look at the trees in the very back, the ones on the left, and this is one like where, get out your microscopes. But the trees in the very back apparently are more bare, and the trees on the right are just starting to bud a little bit. So a little bit of a seasonal change that, maybe small children with perfect vision can see. And then there's a few other details that, have sort of caught people's eyes. So sort of one thing that I find really striking is one common practice in the Middle Ages is during the season of Lent, you would cover various religious images, statues, things like that, with shrouds. And so if you look closely inside the church, you can see those sort of a couple of white things coming down that sort of look like statues that have been just covered with sort of a shroud. And so that's depicting that practice of just during this period, we sort of cover that. There's also my favorite lady, because I just did spring cleaning at my house, and you can sort of see in that house, the yellowish house in the middle, we've got people, washing windows, which again, I feel like is a great metaphor for just this season of we're cleaning the household. I'm out, weeding the garden, and hopefully also weeding a little bit of the sins out of my soul. So just a time of growth, renewal. And of course, today is a time for eating and celebrating and relaxing a bit. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you again for having me. And I'm happy to take questions or just stay around to chat a little after.